Good morning, everyone. I'm Sally Munger from the Forums Committee, and I'm here today to introduce JT Haines, who's the Northeastern Minnesota Director of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, a group that we are so happy is in Minnesota because they do such good work. JT is an attorney with the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy and has worked a lot on the PolyMet issue and knows a lot about the copper nickel mining situation in Minnesota. So I asked him if he would come and give us an update on what is happening with copper nickel mining in Minnesota, including not just PolyMet, but the twin metals. So we will let JT talk to us about this. He has a lot of knowledge in the area, and then at the end you can ask any questions that you have. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to JT Haines.
Well, thank you, Sally, and also thank you to the Forums Committee and Brett and Carol and everyone for the invitation. It's really nice to have the opportunity to chat with everybody this morning. Brett, I just lost the gallery view. I think I should try to get that back here. Well, yep, there we go. Nice to be able to see folks in the event that you want to wave at me during the presentation, or if I need to answer a question as we go. As Sally mentioned, we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end too. But anyway, yes, I am JT Haines. I am the Northeastern Minnesota Director with the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And we're going to be talking mostly about PolyMet today. We'll also touch on twin metals. I did want to first just briefly introduce the organization. I know some of you are familiar with MCEA and others of you may be less so. And I'm going to flip to the next slide here, Brett. I have exciting news to share for anyone who may not be aware of this. So MCEA has been around since 1974. Traditionally, we've been mostly a handful of like kind of hardworking lawyers doing their best in Minnesota's courts and at the agencies to enforce Minnesota's environmental laws. Traditionally like 10 or so employees for the longest time. And in the recent years, we've actually grown quite a bit where we're now at about 30 employees. And we have a dozen lawyers. Our leadership has lawyers as well, but we have about a dozen practicing lawyers too. So I think one thing that really sets us apart in the environmental space is a really deep, talented bench of attorneys, which is super necessary for enforcing the laws that we have. One of the things that we really value our partnerships, including with UUCD and Sierra Club and 350 and organizations, Citizens Climate Lobby and Duluth, is, you know, we're not traditionally an organizing organization. We're not out in the streets, like really getting to know people, working with people to move the system, right? We need folks moving the system, and we participate in that as well. But we are our primary role is within the system to enforce the laws that we have. So, you know, sometimes when you get in these really difficult legal battles with billion-dollar companies, you can't just do that with one or two lawyers. You need a team of lawyers because they're going to throw a lot of things at you over the course of years. So I think that's a unique thing that MCEA brings, and it's one of the reasons I'm really proud to be part of the organization. So part of this growth we've experienced recently is I'm actually the first non-St. Paul based staff member. I came on in 2019. Actually, Sally introduced me at that time too to folks at Zeitgeist in Duluth when we first came to Duluth. So I'm the first non-St. Paul based staff member. And the thought at the time, and the thought still, is this is a statewide organization. A lot of the really key environmental issues in Minnesota are happening right here in the Northeastern Minnesota. Duluth, in so many ways, socioeconomically, geographically, politically, is kind of ground zero for some of the biggest, most important environmental issues in the world. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that, especially with the Lake Superior here, the Line 3 project being built. You know the list. I mean, it's a really important place. So MCEA brought me on in 2019, and then in 2020, we opened a physical office in Duluth in the DeWitt Sites building. Now, of course, that happened right around the time the closure notices were going on. So we haven't really had an opportunity to have a lot of stuff happen in the office with people in person. So I'm looking forward to that sometime, hopefully soon. But we are committed to Duluth and Northeastern Minnesota, and the organization's commitment to the area just continues to grow. And that's one thing that I've really appreciated about MCEA's leadership. So we've got this link for you in the chat. The organization's URL is mncenter.org. So please, if you want more information about the organization, sign up to take action, sign up for our updates. mncenter.org is how you do that. Okay, on to the topic of the day, which is sulfide mining, sometimes called non-ferrous mining, sometimes called copper nickel mining. It's called a number of things depending on who you're talking to and what they may be trying to emphasize. The reason we call it sulfide mining is to emphasize what's different about it than what we're used to here in Minnesota. And there's not a lot of cameras on, so I can't really do like an informal poll here about who knows what sulfide mining is. So I'm just going to assume, a kind of a range of background in terms of sulfide mining. So the basic core concept here is we've been doing ferrous mining or iron mining in Minnesota for over 100 years. First, that was really high grade red rock that you could just dig out of the ground, and that was iron. And for decades, that's what we were mining. We started to run out of that ore, the high grade iron ore. And through some taxpayer funded initiatives with the university and other research, we figured out a way to continue to mine lower grade ferrous ore with what's now called taconite mining. So that's lower grade iron mining. We bake that into taconite pellets and ship that off to the steel facilities. So that's what we've been doing since. So for over 100 years, it's been iron mining, then lower grade taconite mining. The proposals you may be hearing about recently in the last 10 to 15 years, by the way, the sulfide mining proposals have actually been kind of lingering and surfacing here and there for actually many decades, since the 70s. It's really kind of taken off in the past 10 to 15 years. And the first sulfide mining proposal to hit the permitting stage in Minnesota is PolyMet. So what's different about sulfide mining is it's non-ferrous mining. So with ferrous mining, with iron mining, sorry, my dog is just returning from a walk. So I'm gonna take one moment here to be a little bit distracted. She's getting a drink of water. I don't know if you all can hear that. It's pretty loud on my end. Okay, she just came back from the park. Anyway, so when iron mining tailings are exposed to air and water and oxygen, it's like when iron is exposed to air and water and oxygen, it oxidates, right? It rusts, which is a form of pollution, but it's a relatively benign form of pollution. When rust is exposed to our waterways, it has deleterious impacts downstream, but it's not what's called acid mine drainage. That's the big difference with sulfide mining. When sulfide ore bearing rock is exposed to oxygen, it produces sulfuric acid, which can leach acid and heavy metals into downstream waters. So that's kind of the key difference. And that's the reason folks are so interested in these new proposals for sulfide mining, which again, has never actually taken place yet in the state of Minnesota. If the PolyMet mine is built, it would be the first built and operated sulfide mine in the state of Minnesota, which, in our mind, there's a lot of talk about the company's proposal and the degree to which it's experimental versus based on science, et cetera. But whatever one concludes about that, it is the case that this would in effect be an experiment with Minnesota's clean waters with a brand new type of mining that we have never done here before. Did you get enough water? You feeling good? Okay. Okay, so that's the core concept with sulfide mining. Different from taconite mining, not rust, but acid. Here's the other core concept that is really important to know, which is where the current proposal is located. And this is something, as recently as 2015, 2016, a lot of us were pretty surprised at the degree to which there is confusion about this, even in Duluth, right here on the shores of Lake Superior, and, at the St. Louis River and the estuary. The PolyMet mine proposal is actually in the Lake Superior watershed, and hopefully you can see from this map here. You probably know Minnesota is a phenomenally amazing place geographically. We've got not only 3 biomes in our state, which is very unique. We've got the Eastern Forest biome, the Western Prairies, and the Northern Boreal. That's already very unique. here in Northeastern Minnesota, we have 3 major watersheds. And right here on the Laurentian Divide, you can see all 3 of them. On the west is the Mississippi watershed, which flows south. To the north is the Rainy River or Boundary Waters watershed, which flows north to the Hudson. And to the south and east is the Lake Superior watershed, which flows to the St. Louis River watershed, Lake Superior Basin, and then of course east from there. So the sulfide mining proposals are located near and around this divide, which is, by the way, that's not really an accident. That's a geographic, that's a result of the history of the area and the geographic rock structures and et cetera. That ore is exposed there because of the divide. So you've heard of Twin Metals, you've heard of PolyMet. They're actually 12 miles apart. One's on the Lake Superior side, PolyMet. Twin Metals is on the Rainy River Boundary Water side, Twin Metals. So you can see PolyMet here that is in our watershed here in the Lake Superior watershed. And that's a really key fact that for a lot of years was kind of getting glossed over, that I think more and more people are really starting to recognize now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just kind of the core facts about PolyMet. If this mine is built, what would we be looking at here in Northeastern Minnesota? And for this, we're going to draw facts from the company's own documents. So what I want to emphasize here is this is what we would be looking at in what might be thought of as a quote best case scenario. This is a scenario where the company actually does what it's saying it's going to do, which for folks who have followed the mining industry in this country, that's generally not what happens. Most of the time, they fall short of what they say they're going to do. They don't generally exceed expectations. But this is like assuming the truth of the advanced promises, assuming a best case scenario. This is what the company would like to do upstream of Duluth. First of all, it would be the largest permitted destruction of wetlands in Minnesota's history. I think there's some folks in Duluth who really understand why wetlands are important. It took me some time to really get it. Like, I'm used to, I grew up on the Iron Range. I remember like kind of playing in the swamps. You get some leeches on your ankles and like there's kind of like chest high grasses and it's just kind of gross. And you're like, we drain them to build things. And you think of wetlands as almost a little bit of a nuisance, and you got to kind of take a step back to recognize the brilliance of them, like from a biodiversity standpoint and just how they came to develop. The really key factor today is that they're a huge source of carbon sink. Peatlands and wetlands are one of the major remaining sources of carbon sink, in addition to forests that we have in the world. So they're storing carbon, and this would, if built, this would be a 900-acre direct destruction of wetlands at the site, and then 7,000 acres indirect impact from dewatering downstream of the site. So as you can see here, I've got, just so you can kind of visualize it a bit, that's almost 700 football fields, just the direct destruction. And that's the largest, if we permit that, that's the largest permitted destruction of wetlands in our history, which would result in a immediate 2% increase in Minnesota's net greenhouse gas emissions just in the first year. And that's not accounting for the ongoing emissions related to operating the mine, right? Which is another major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So huge permanent destruction of wetlands. You can't get those back. I mean, people talk about wetlands banking and credits, with wetlands elsewhere. That's not really how this works. When you destroy an acre of wetlands, you've destroyed an acre of wetlands. Whatever numbers you move around on a piece of paper somewhere else, like that, those wetlands are real, they exist. Also, the permanent pollution of water. This is a fact that has kind of shocked me over the years as well. The PolyMet proposal is to appropriate 6 billion gallons of water per year, which they currently have a permit for. That permit's being challenged, but they have a permit for 6 billion a year at $8 per million gallons. Now, of course, there are less costs to produce that water than, like, for example, drinking water in residential areas here in Duluth. But nonetheless, I hope that number kind of surprises you a little bit. That seems like a pretty low price for our pretty precious, clean, fresh water here in Minnesota, which is a limited resource. So that water would require, once polluted, would require indefinite treatment. and this is kind of another amazing fact to me. So they want to store this polluted water in a 900-acre pond or lake or tailings basin. So you can picture 700 football field with polluted water in it, and that's held back by a dam, which we'll talk about in a moment. But from that, it's an unlined tailings basin, so water would actually leak from the basin, and that's on purpose, right? Because otherwise it would overtop. Like you have precipitation come into the basin, and eventually that polluted water would overtop the dam and cause other problems. So the leaking of water is actually part of the plan. Now, what they'd like to do is put a 5-mile long recapture trench around the basin, around the unlined basin, to kind of try to capture this polluted water as it's leaving so they can treat it, right, and release it. That one of the quotes from our senior attorney, Ann Cohen, on this thing that has always stuck with me is she says, the 5-mile recapture trench is a joke. And she had 32 years of experience as an attorney with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So she's not really prone to hyperbolic language. So when she said the 5-mile capture trench is a joke, I wrote that on a Post-it note that's on my wall in my office. It is a pretty phenomenal concept, right? Like, so we're going to catch the water in this trench and then pump it back into the basin with mechanical pumps, which mechanical pumps require energy to operate, and they require humans to operate them. And that's supposed to be happening and maintained indefinitely, literally indefinitely, until the company comes up with some better plan to deal with this permanently polluted water. That's literally the plan right now, is just do this until there's a better idea. So even if they are able to maintain this trench and these pumps indefinitely, the plan is still to release 16 million gallons of this polluted water, untreated polluted water, into the downstream waters per year. So part of the plan is actually to deliberately release this polluted water. It's important to be aware of that. I think it's a little hard even for most scientists, hard for me too, to picture what 16 million gallons really means. Like maybe in the grand scheme in Minnesota, that's a small amount of water. I don't know, but I think for our purposes here, it's just important to be aware that part of the plan is permanent release of pollution. And then of course, the most visceral thing to be aware of downstream. By the way, just backing up a moment to think about what's downstream. Of course, we're talking about Lake Superior and Duluth, but we're also talking about Cloquet and Esco and the Fond du Lac Band and Reservation and communities all the way up the St. Louis River to the Embarrass River and Partridge River. So we're talking about 250,000 people actually in this area. So those folks, if this is built, would have upstream of them forever a 250-foot dam whose job it is to hold back this pollution. So the problem with that, even beyond just the scale of having a 900-acre polluted pond upstream of us and a dam of that size of us, the scale of that is already an issue. That thing has to work, or that pollution is headed our way, and it has to work basically indefinitely. So there's been a lot of questions about their dam design, and that's one of the things our lawyers have been arguing about in court. And then one other problem, even in a best case scenario, is the Fond du Lac Band has objected to this proposal. I think, I can't speak for the degree to which the band feels that it has been consulted adequately on this proposal, but I do know that they have objected to it. They've submitted comments about it, and they are currently in federal court challenging the wetlands destruction permit. So, I think beyond the MCEA cases in state court, if you are interested in following a federal case, really, really important one right now is the Fond du Lac's case about the wetlands destruction permit in federal court. So I wanted to just talk about a little bit more about this upstream dam design. So what they proposed is called an upstream dam, and that doesn't mean it's upstream of us. It is upstream of us, but what that means is it's how the dam is built and designed, which is you are stacking material on top of the dam in an upstream direction, and you're using tailings produced in the process to build up that dam as it fills up with water. So two things about this. First, it is the cheapest form of dam design. And there was a major disaster in British Columbia in 2014 at the Mount Poly facility, which we actually had some folks from British Columbia come to Duluth in 2018 to talk about this. They had a total dam failure with an upstream dam design. And that was supposed to be a no discharge facility. And since that complete catastrophe, which released tailings into Quesnel Lake and a really key salmon spawning area and First Nations territory, they've actually since then, to deal with this dam breach, they've had to like redo the permits to make them discharge permits. So it's kind of like, feels a little backwards how that works. Like they've applied for a no discharge permit, their dam fails, now they have a discharge permit. Since that Mount Poly dam breach, there was a Mount Poly review panel, and that review panel's recommendation was don't do these things. Like there should be a zero harm principle, and you should be using best available technology. Upstream dam design is not best available technology. It's the cheapest form. So we've actually seen two major issues even since Mount Poly. In 2018, some of you may have heard of the Brumadinho Dam in Brazil, the Vale company. That was also an upstream dam design. And by the way, the point of this slide here is you can see the similarity in design between what Brumadinho had and what PolyMet is proposing. And there's some, commonalities in like, engineers who've weighed in on it, et cetera. So the Brumadinho Dam, I say had because it completely failed. The whole thing failed and released tailings downstream, and actually killed hundreds of people. It was a total tragedy. And yet another example of why these dams are not safe. And as like lower grade mining, as we're using up a lot of the higher grade ores around the world. And as we use lower and lower grade ores, it produces more and more tailings, more and more pollution, putting more and more pressure on larger and larger dams. So this is not a linear line towards progress and safety. This is actually like we're experiencing setbacks because the dams are getting bigger and more dangerous. So the country of Brazil, since Brumadinho, has actually banned upstream dam designs and is decommissioning existing upstream dams. Pretty amazing, given that the state of Minnesota is actively contemplating building a new upstream dam in Minnesota. Pretty remarkable. So one other thing to mention is last year, I think it might have been around January, there was a facility in Florida that was, did anyone see this happening? There was like the governor declared an state of emergency in Florida. There was a dam failing in Florida, polluting downstream communities. I think it was a phosphorus facility. And that also was an upstream dam. And that happened right here in the United States. So these things are happening worldwide, and it is not best practices to build an upstream dam. I don't know that anyone disputes that there's a disagreement about this. The disagreement has been about whether we should have public hearings about it. There have not been public hearings about it. There have been, sorry, let me rephrase. There have been the big public hearings at like the deck where people come and give their 3 minutes of testimony, but there haven't been court or legislative hearings where there are witnesses under oath on the stand where experts can speak to this under oath. So that's another fact I think shocks a lot of people is we've kind of rushed this thing through. The agencies kind of rushed it through, and we actually haven't had a witness on the stand to talk about these things. MCEA has experts who want to get on the stand and say what the problem is with these, and then the company and the agencies would have an opportunity to have their experts on the stand as well. There's been 0 fact witnesses on the stand in the entire 15-year process, which I think given the risk here, I think is not appropriate. So this is kind of just for fun. The local group, grassroots group, Duluth for Clean Water. It's an all volunteer group. I think a lot of folks, you probably are familiar with it. Commissioned this editorial cartoon for the Duluth News a few years ago. Obviously, it's not scientifically accurate, but but there was a point to be made here, which is this is, that's not what the dam would look like, right? But it's a big hulking dam upstream of our beautiful river and lake. So when Sally invited me to speak, one of the things she said we definitely need to touch on, and this maybe should be the main thing we touch on, is like, where is this thing? Like, what is the PolyMet debate has been going on for a long time. There was an environmental review in like 2014 through 2017. Permits were issued in 2018. We've been in court since then, right? So where are we now? What is going on now? And I think the shortest answer is at the moment we're winning, which is hard to do, by the way. Like, agencies are granted a tremendous amount of deference by the courts. The agencies are tasked with making decisions based on Minnesota state law. And then usually the courts figure the agencies are the best at determining what the legislature had in mind, right? And the courts shouldn't interfere with that. Well, what's happening here is these permits have been so flawed and the application has been so flawed that we're actually winning these cases at the highest levels. That's partly due to the talent of our team, but I think they would all agree it's mostly due to the fact that these permits are just inherently flawed. So there are 4 main permits. There's like 20 permits associated with this proposal, but there's 4 main ones that we can touch on here. The big central permit that is required to operate is called the permit to mine. That's at the DNR. That was rejected by the Court of Appeals and then rejected again by the Minnesota Supreme Court and sent back to the DNR. It was rejected for 2 reasons. One I kind of alluded to earlier. The permit didn't have an end date. It failed to set a term. That's a pretty basic requirement in state law. Is like there has to be an end to these things. Like there has to be a plan to reclaim the area and have an end to the process. There was no term set in the permit. So the court sent it back to the agency to look at that. And then one of the substantive pieces that the court rejected was this, and I'll just be honest, this is a hard one to talk about in a brief amount of time. It's so complicated. The media has had trouble with this too. It's called the Bentonite Amendment. Bentonite is a form of clay, and the company is proposing to mix a very low percentage of clay, bentonite, 3%, with tailings, and use that to like put on the dam walls and basin beaches and floor to try to reduce the reactivity of the tailings with oxygen, so to reduce the amount of pollution that's created. What the court found and what we argued is there's no evidence, 0 evidence, that this would actually work. It has never been field tested. We've never seen it work at this scale. So this bentonite scheme, we call it a scheme because we think it is a scheme. There's no evidence that it would actually work. And the court said, look, DNR, we will generally defer to you if there's basically any evidence at all that what you're saying will work. And in this case, there's literally nothing in the record, 0 in the record to suggest that this would actually work. So they sent it back to the DNR to readdress this clay liner scheme that's supposed to be reducing pollution. So stay tuned on that. So in terms of the status of that, the agency is currently deciding what they're going to do. Are they going to just adjust the permit? Are they going to restart the whole process? Are they going to have hearings about the bentonite scheme? Which, by the way, our position is they at minimum should have public hearings about the bentonite scheme. So we're waiting to hear what the agency will do with that. Another state agency involved here, of course, is the Pollution Control Agency. They are responsible for the air pollution permit. They issued a pollution permit to PolyMet based on a mine plan that would process 32,000 tons per day of ore. Meanwhile, PolyMet has been telling its investors that it has alternative plans for a much larger mine, for a 118,000 ton per day mine. And the reason we think they have this kind of like dual story is there are 2 types of air permits. There's a minor permit and a major permit. And when you apply for a major permit, you have to use best available technologies to control the air pollution. 32,000 tons per day comes just under that and allowed them to apply for a minor permit. It's called a minor synthetic. But meanwhile, they want to tell their investors, hey, there's an opportunity to make some money here. At 32,000 tons per day, we're barely profitable, if profitable. At 118,000 tons per day, we are profitable. So they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth here. Like, yeah, investors, like we got bigger plans in store here. But hey, Minnesota, don't worry about those bigger plans yet. We're really just applying for the smaller permit now. But you know, anyone who's paid any amount of attention to this knows, and fortunately the court noticed this too. Once the train's out of the station, it's rolling, right? It's hard to turn a train around. You can't just build a mine and then decide later how big it should be, right? You gotta figure that out in advance. So that's why there's a concept in law called sham permitting, and we have argued that this is an example of sham permitting. And the Supreme Court has sent this back to the PCA to say, hey, you need to actually investigate this evidence that MCEA has brought forward about this larger mine plan, and you need to issue findings about it. You can't just say, we're not worried about that now, it's speculative, we'll worry about it later. You have to actually investigate it. So we're waiting to hear from the PCA what their plans are as well. So that permit is also back at the agency. There's been a lot of hubbub around the water pollution permit too. You may have seen a year or two ago, there were some documents leaked from the federal agency, which was the EPA, from like staff scientists who said, hey, we had a lot of concerns about this water permit. It doesn't have enforceable numeric limits, which are called WQ-BELs, water quality-based effluent limits. It doesn't have those in the permit. So we're not actually sure this water permit's even enforceable. And I'm not exaggerating to say our MPCA said, hold on, please don't submit those written comments during the public comment process. Please hold on to those until after the comment process is over. Sounds like a Hollywood film sometimes, right? So staff from the MPCA got on the phone with the scientists at EPA after the comment period and heard these 29 concerns over the phone, and then took notes and then conveniently lost those notes. So total scandal, right? Where our state agency actively suppressed the federal agency concerns to the degree that the federal union members leaked this memo with the 29 concerns through their union. So, I mean, pretty incredible stuff. So right now that permit is back at the MPCA to deal with these EPA scientists' concerns, which have only come out because of good folks at the agency acting in the public interest and nonprofits in Minnesota, like, making sure to get this data. So our lawyers are at the Court of Appeals right now. We've got an oral argument coming up. That lawyer's name is Elise Larson. She's the lead attorney on the PCA side, on the water permit side. Really brilliant attorney. She's from the Brainerd area. And then finally, I already mentioned the wetlands destruction permit. The Fond du Lac Band has been doing amazing work for a really long time. Their lead scientist is a woman by the name of Nancy Schultz. Some of you folks may have met her. She's done a lot of work to make sure the Fond du Lac's right as a sovereign nation to get determinations from the agencies about this project actually happen. And one of those determinations is called a may affect determination. And the Environmental Protection Agency, the feds again, found that the PolyMet proposal may affect the downstream Fond du Lac Band. So now the band has the right to object to the permit and have a hearing at the Army Corps about the impacts of the wetlands permit. So that's also forthcoming and also a really important thing to track. So we'll talk about this a little more when we get to questions and actions too. But just to wrap up the PolyMet conversation here before we move to Twin Metals, one of the things we're saying at MCEA now is, based on this review, which has seen an inadequate EIS, it's seen inadequate permits, it's seen those permits get sent back to the agencies, it's seen now 2 different governor administrations involved in this. We've spent millions of dollars as a state defending these permits, which suffer from flaws which are inherent to the company's application. So what we've started to say in the last month or two is Governor Walz, let's move on. There's no reason we need to keep throwing good after bad here. Let's move on to a proposal for sustainable economic development in Northeastern Minnesota that supports not just the communities of Hoyt Lakes and Aurora and the East Range, but also the downstream communities all the way to Duluth, that respects all communities along the watershed. And by the way, also adequately takes into account what the band is saying about this. So let's move on. Send the application back to the company and say, this thing, there's too many problems. There's no reason this needs to continue to be our problem. If you want to submit a new application, that's up to you. So that's what we feel. That's where we feel at MCEA we are right now. And we are in the process of developing a coalition around this message, which at some point we will deliver to the governor. We have not set a timeline for that yet, partly because of the fluidity of what's happening with the agencies, but partly also to just make sure the word is out about it. So it is getting out, and you can see some of the big orgs that have already signed on, their logos at the bottom here. You can see MCEA, Friends, Duluth for Clean Water, Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity, the Ikes, some local groups in the Twin Cities area, Minnesota Environmental Partnership, MNIPL, Brett Pence and his folks, Honor, Water Legacy, and the League of Women Voters, Duluth and statewide. So a lot of really prominent organizations coming on. Since this graphic was created, MN350 came on board, Take Action Minnesota came on board, and by the way, the UUCD came on board. So that's another thing I'm really happy to share. And I'll just take this moment to thank you folks for signing on to this coalition. Your board of trustees voted to sign on. It's the first faith community to sign on. So you're breaking ground here, and we hope other faith communities will follow suit. But I guess part of the point here too is you can see that a lot of the prominent environmental organizations signed on, and the ones that are focused on mining. But now you're seeing Honor the Earth focused on Line 3, IPL and 350 focused on climate, Take Action Minnesota focused on social justice broadly. Like this is a bigger thing than a mining issue. There are broad social justice implications to this proposal. So that's why it's really great to see this coalition forming that has a broad range of interests about why this is important to downstream communities. Okay, it's 10:06. I'm going to take one brief breather here in case there's like any immediate questions about PolyMet before I give a quick status update on the Twin Metals proposal.
The only thing in the chat so far, JT, and you've done such a great job being so thorough and yet accessible, is a question from Will asking if you could explain why so much water is issued in the process of sulfide mining.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Will. Because it's low grade ore, mining is a very, very water intensive process. It's a land and water intensive process, and it takes a lot of water to process the ore to extract the parts of it that we actually want. So in the case of copper mining, I think the grade is less than 1%. It's like 0.5% grade. So what that means is we're trying to extract 0.5% copper from the sulfide bearing ore. So the waste is 99.5% waste. And it takes a lot of water to accomplish that. It's the most polluting industry in the world. From a water pollution standpoint, it also accounts for 4 to 7% of greenhouse gas emissions. So mining is a really, really intensive industry and intensive process that involves a tremendous amount of pollution. And as we continue to mine lower and lower grade ores, it involves more and more pollution. And part of that is more and more water.
How do they extract the copper and nickel from the ore? Is it something like you dissolve it in sulfuric acid and then reclaim it, or something else?
Yeah, and I would need to get one of our science experts on to give you a thorough answer to this particular question, but it's a flotation system where they use chemicals to process. They mix chemicals with the ore and then float up some of the stuff that they want, and you skim that off, and you do that until you've reduced it to the stuff that you want. That was the most layperson version of an answer to that story, but yes, you use chemicals and water to process the ore, and there's some kind of skimming mechanism that helps you do that. Did that answer your question at all? That's something, if you want more technical aspects of that, I can follow up with you separately about that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, a brief update on Twin Metals. Sally asked me to give this update as well, because this is another really big, important proposal in our region. The two key things to note about it are, one, the location. So you can see from this slide, this is a different version of the same map we looked at earlier, where you can see the Mesabi Iron Range in the kind of the light, and my apologies, it's very hard to read, but the Mesabi Range is in that kind of lighter gray below, which is the same watershed, Lake Superior watershed, where we are, where the PolyMet proposal is located. Just across that gray line, the Laurentian Divide, is the Rainy River watershed. And the Twin Metals proposal is just on the other side of that. You can kind of see it where that river kind of hooks an angle there, takes a turn. Yep, that's about where Twin Metals would be. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing to know is it's not nearly as far along in the process. There's been a lot of work done in terms of the federal lease process, and there's been some court cases about lease renewals. Some of these are legacy leases that have been renewed, and there's been some arguments about that. But there's no state permit application yet. So there's going to continue to be issues at the federal level in terms of whether these leases will be renewed. There's also a current case that some boundary waters focus groups have filed in Minnesota. Actually, I think we can flip to the next slide for this. So the thing that's happening currently in court on the Twin Meadows proposal is some boundary waters groups are challenging our sulfide mining rules as inadequate to protect the Rainy River watershed. And at MCEA, I just want to say we support this challenge. We also don't think our dated sulfide mining rules are adequate to protect the boundary waters. But one thing I want to add is we don't think they're adequate to protect the Lake Superior watershed either. So the current case in Minnesota court is just specific to the boundary waters watershed. They're, in a way, I don't want to say pitting watersheds against each other, but in a way, they're distinguishing one watershed from another. And that has not been MCEA's strategy. Our strategy is to protect all the watersheds in Minnesota. And if their mining rules aren't good enough for one, they're not good enough for the other. But nonetheless, by the way, another thing to note here is the executive director of one of these organizations was the person who literally issued the PolyMet permits as the DNR commissioner. He signed the permits, and now his organization is saying those very same rules are inadequate. They're adequate for Lake Superior and Duluth, but they're inadequate for the boundary waters. We're not sure that that reasoning holds water, to use a bad pun. So that's not the strategy we are pursuing, but nonetheless, we do agree that the rules are not adequate to protect the boundary waters. So we are supporting that effort. So in the event that there are rule changes as a result of that lawsuit, there would likely be further litigation about those rule changes. I guess part of the summary here is we're years away from where PolyMet is currently, where and we're definitely many years away from any Twin Meadows mine being built. So the feds will continue to look at the lease issue. The state will look at the rule changes, that lawsuit, and then depending on how those things go, if there is an application, which there isn't currently, if there is an application, then we get into the whole process you've seen with PolyMet, where there's public hearings about Twin Meadows proposal. If the state issues permits, there would likely be litigation about those again. And then we would probably be in a multi-year process with litigation about those permits as well. So our lawyers are tracking. We don't have an open project on this now. It's an investigation. So we're tracking the issue, and multi-year process is likely. And of course, if this lands in, if there are state law issues in state court, of course, MCEA lawyers will be involved in Twin Meadows as well. Okay, so that is a presentation on PolyMet and a brief update on Twin Meadows. And that is a campaign where we're seeking individual support and organizational support. So we set a goal of 2,000 signatures by September 7, which we hit with our partners at Sierra Club and others. And the next goal is 5,000 signatures by the end of October. So I can tell you every 5 signatures that comes in is a really big boost. It doesn't sound like it, but like anytime any individual says, JT, I shared this with 10 people, 5 of them signed it, you might be surprised to hear like that actually is a big boost for us. So I really appreciate all individual organizers won't be surprised to hear that, but so I really appreciate all individuals who are able to share and move on from polymet.org with their networks. So appreciate the UUCD Board of Trustees for coming on board. You can see this is a graphic where every time a partner comes on, we toss their logo on the graphic so they can use that for sharing. So we're sharing that with all 24 organizational partners as well. Here's a UUCD one, and I was enjoying the UUCD logo earlier. And Sally and Brett thought you might like to hear that too. I think it's a beautiful logo. It's unique and crisp, and anyway, I really like it. So I would encourage you, especially now that your organization is signed on, to please share and use this graphic if it's helpful to you, and maybe Brett or I can circulate that at some point, make it available. And then if you want, so MCEA is involved in a lot of things, climate and water and many forestry, other issues too. So if you want updates about what our team of attorneys is doing across the board, please sign up for updates at mncenter.org. Obviously the mining issue has been very front of mind, especially here in Northeastern Minnesota. But there's a lot of really important work happening across the state. And then, of course, we hope to be having events in the future too in person. So love to see you all at our future events here in Duluth as well.
JT, I just want to say how grateful I am that you did such an excellent job of updating all the information, answering the questions. And I know that most Unitarians are probably already signed on, but we'll certainly take advantage of that. And I also want to mention the organization that I know you helped co-found, Duluth for Clean Water, which is another organization that people might, if they're not already aware of, might want to get more knowledgeable about, because you are dogging all of these issues for us. So thank you so much for your excellent, excellent presentation.
Well, thank you, Sally. It was a pleasure, and thank you, Brett, and the committee. And yeah, it's really great to be here.